All right. Welcome to the February 16th Grafana Agent Community Call. I'm Matthew Durham, and I'll be doing a short demo over an experimental feature called dynamic configuration. Before we get started, um, dynamic configuration is an experimental feature, which means it can have a whole lot of churn in configuration, how it works and how it feels. And it also is not a replacement for any other previous configurations. Your old style configuration will work just fine. So as we start here, I just want to go take a quick minute or two to go over why we're doing it and how we're doing it. So first of all, when we got talking to a lot of customers, they have large configuration files that are extremely complex. And we wanted to break that down into smaller sections. So instead of one giant configuration file, you can have multiple separate configuration files that are broken up by area, such as server settings, an overall agent setting, mini integrations. There's documentation that kind of details how all those interact. We also wanted to add, based on the work that Robbie did with remote file loading, allow you to load resources from outside the external file system. This includes things like object storage like S3, GCP, or Linode, pretty much any S3 compatible system. And we'll probably add more providers as we get feedback. Another feature, and this goes into the dynamic part of it, is allowing a person to have a configuration that they don't have to hard code everything, that they can pull data from other sources or query other sources and generate the config specific to the needs instead of having to preload everything. So those are the kind of needs we're meeting with this. And of course, there's a big caveat. This is an incredibly complex feature with a lot of bells and whistles. That complexity is probably the most painful part in the learning curve. Um, we have some guidelines to like prevent the config from loading a bad config, but it is going to be harder to maybe fully wrap your hands around when you're pulling from all these disparate sources. So with that being said, let's talk a second for how we did it. We built upon Dave Henderson's library Gomplate, which is built on Go template. So you get all of those features built in. We added a few of our own just to extend it. And we're hoping that once this kind of leaves experimental, we'll upstream those and not have our own fork. All right. And as I go through this, I should have mentioned earlier, if you have any questions, you can interrupt me. I will not take offense, or you can hit the raise hand button. If you don't want to interrupt me, both are totally fine. Okay. So check time real quick. Try and keep it under 10 minutes. So you can have multiple configs. Like I said, you can have an agent config, integrations config. For today's demo, I'm going to be mostly showing the demo since the agent configs, there's documentation in the PR that you can look at. You can look at any of this. There's a link in the agenda to the PR along with to a link with the documentation. One of the things I'm trying to do with this is to make a cookbook that is far more prescriptive in documentation, that is more focused on how to do something instead of just here's all the config options, go turn the knobs and whistles. Instead, I would much prefer you want to load something from an S3 bucket. Here's how you do it with an example that you can run in a Docker container. So that is what I am going for. These examples all are mostly modifications of the existing examples in the documentation. So you can go and basically follow what I'm doing. And if anybody has any questions, I will pause just for a second, take a sip of water. And if you have any questions, you can jump in now. All right. Just we had a few people join. We're doing the dynamic documentation. As I go through it, feel free to jump in and ask me any questions. All right, now we're going to do the most dangerous thing of presenting a window. It will be a very
Perfect, Matt.
exciting window. It will be a terminal window. And can people see that correctly? And give me a thumbs up or a yay.
You're good.
All right, cool. All right, so I'm going to just go through a few of the demos. There's about 8 on the PR, and I'm going to add a lot more. So these are going to be demos more along the templating, which I think is probably the more interesting side of it. But there is a whole section of demos on just how the configs are loaded and the order that they're loaded. So let's cross our fingers here. So this, I'm just going to spit out what the agent looks like for this simple example. So I have a very basic agent config here. And the only interesting part of this that's abnormal is this right here. So in this, we're essentially going to just iterate and loop over a data source called fruit. And we are going to put the value here. And just to show you the fruit we have mango, peach, and orange. And now the dynamic configuration uses a slightly different, well, it uses a totally different configuration to tell it where to load the configurations from. And I'll only show this one, but this is essentially how it looks like. So we have a template pass. This is a directory that it will load them from. It can be S3, it can be file. That's S3 compatible and file are the ones we're currently supporting, but there are more we can support. Same way with data sources. This is what we saw earlier with this, references this URL. We will find any YAML files that match kind of a default naming standard that's overridable in this directory. And it should be noted, we do not recursively dig into directories. So if you need multiple file paths, multiple directories, you have to specify multiple under template. All right. So this will run it. Unfortunately, it spits out the whole configuration. But we can see that we have orange, peach, and mango. So it pulled from our 3 values from the JSON file, and nothing too crazy there. All right. Now, let's go to something a little more complex. And this is that exact same example, except it is loading everything from S3. The configuration is being loaded from S3, and the fruits.json is being loaded from S3. And you can see here, I'm using agent cuddle. And template parse, instead of running the agent to generate it, this just runs the same code and spits out the config. And you can see I'm using S3, and then my bucket, and all that jazz. Okay. Need to get rid of that error popping up. But as always, so we have peach, mango, peach, and orange. And then it spit out this error here, well, where I didn't close it properly. But so that's loading. That means you can have an agent with no state on the device and just pass a S3 config file. And if you wanted to update that, you could update that S3 config and call reload on all the endpoints. Go ahead, Robert.
So with the S3 example, where was it getting the data sources for the fruits that time?
From this file here.
Right.
I don't know if I have handy on my device. It has an S3 fruits data source.
Okay. So nothing's coming from the local disk. It's all like built up from multiple things. Okay, gotcha. Cool.
Let me see if I can. Mario, go ahead.
Yeah. So are all these values the default value for remote, right? Or
yes,
did it pull it from? Okay.
Well, it pulls it from the global. So it's the global value that I defined, okay. And then it applies it to these like a normal agent. So I just pasted in what the file that's in S3. So you can see the template file is a bucket in S3, and the data source itself is a JSON file in S3. So that means you can have a no config on the instance or device. And if you update that S3 and call the reload points, you don't have to push any configuration. It will just organically pull that new configuration and apply it. Robert?
So let's say someone wanted to have different agents pull different files from S3. Is there any way to send information from like the local machine? Maybe just environment variables, or maybe anything
You
else
can do
there?
it with environment variables. That's the only thing that initially jumps out at me is you could have environment variables. Now the thing you could do is the configs that you're loading could have templates that can be loaded upon environment variables also. So you could load the same config, but based on host name or environment variables, you could have different behaviors.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. It's a lot of options to tune, which can make it, if you have a lot of complexity, that's kind of the cost you pay for. I'm going to Bjornvaj. I'm sorry if I butchered that.
Just say Borek. That's easier. Yeah.
Right.
A simple question: where do you take the credentials for your S3 access from, please?
So currently, it just uses the traditional environment variables. There are overrides you can do that Gunpla supports that I will document. But at this point, it's the easiest way is just the AWS environment variable, secret key, and whatever the other one is. Yeah. If there is feedback like supporting like profiles or something like that, that's definitely the feedback we would want to get on like having it be more configurable in that standpoint.
Thank you.
Cool. All right. Now, not only can you load simple arrays, you can load objects. So this is an agent template that is going to pull from a data source called computers. So let's say you had a data source that had a list of all the computers or VMs that you wanted to track. And you can do all the Go templating here. So ensure that there's more than 0, and then iterate over the range. If it's enabled, then essentially make it the name and the IP. And if we look at that computers.json file, we have web host 1 enabled, web host 2 is not enabled, web host 3 is enabled. So ideally, when I run this through, I should see web host 1 and web host 3 and not web host 2. Robert?
I don't want to cut ahead of what you might show, but it might not be immediately obvious. From what I've seen from this so far, data sources don't have to just be JSON files, right? Like they can be retrieved from other locations.
Yes, they can be. There is a whole list on Gunplate's website, console, I think AWS secrets, any type of file pretty much. I think CSV, YAML, JSON. They can be just a huge range of options that you can pull data from. And in the last example, we'll start actually querying data sources like EC2 and some additional support for those more complex scenarios. Cool. And then up here, we can see web host 1 and 3 are a scrape config, and web host 2 is not. All right. So we can talk about a more complex example here. So this is a feature I added to Gunplate that's currently in our fork, and it's the ability to query EC2. A lot of customers exist in or a lot of people, customers, wrong word, a lot of users exist in cloud environments, and we want to add the ability to query those so it can be very dynamic. And in this case, this is a EC2 query. You pass it a query string. There is a ton of different ways you can slice and dice a EC2 query. It's documented in the link. There's a link in the documentation to all of those. In this case, I'm doing a very simple one. If the VM is labeled as web host, then I will want to tag it and pass in the private DNS name as a target. Okay. And so what I've got here, this little bit here, the job name is just the instance name. It's probably not ideal, but it could be anything you wanted there. And then the target is the internal DNS name. Now, go ahead, Robert.
I'll let you finish first. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say this lets you, if you have if you deploy new VMs, if you set a reload timer, which is something I hope to add, or just call the reload endpoint, you will automatically kind of pick up any new targets, and any targets that have been deleted will fall off, and you won't scrape those. So in this case, you can just automatically, as long as you tag it or query it correctly, you can have automatic scraping without any kind of manual intervention from the user or from you all as you deploy new VMs. All right, Robert.
So I'm imagining like one of the common questions we might get about this would be, how is this different than EC2 configs or EC2 SD configs from Prometheus? And I think the answer in this case, it's not different, right? But do you have an example of what you might be able to use this for that you couldn't just do with like SD configs?
The only thing I could think with SD configs or the EC2 SD configs, if you do get maybe a little bit more autonomy on what you want to add to things, you get more flexibility in that regard. And as far as just querying EC2, there's probably not a ton of that. Like, there's probably not a huge difference. But there are additional avenues, like there's other providers that would probably give you slightly more flexibility. So for instance, at a place I worked at that was an on-prem environment, I'm not going to say this is best practice, but it's how we did it back in the ancient days. We had a database that had a listing of all of our VMs, very, very long running VMs. And in this, you could essentially query that database and generate your config all based off that.
I think one way you might be able to use this is to derive a list of integrations. So if you have a tag that's like, this EC2 runs a MySQL server, then you could use that to iterate over how many MySQL exporters you're spawning up for each EC2. Like I think that's one unique way that you couldn't do today without this kind of
That's
functionality.
True. Yeah, and I have an example, I think, with Redis and the full documentation, if not. But yeah, you can totally wrap the configuration in the integrations block and iterate through that. That being said, one caveat is this does only work with the V2 integrations that we just released. When did we release that? Whatever the most recent release was. Yeah, what's it to? Okay. So that does need to be enabled for this. And one of the main reasons is because it allows you to do integrations as an array. So if you have a bunch of MySQL instances, you can dynamically scrape those with the exporter. All right. So yeah, I tried to keep it at like 10 or 15 minutes to just not eat up all the time. So does anyone have any other questions or thoughts?
So if I get it right, basically for each configuration change, you need to call that agent control utility, right?
So the agent cuddle is just a way for me to output the config. The agent, if I like, if you were to use the agent, config.dynamic configuration. I off the top of my head, I believe that's the flag. If you called the agent like this, that would load that configuration and do essentially the same templating and loading of resources, and then just use that as the config.
So it would periodically re-evaluate the complete expression and respond to changes in that, right?
That is one of the features I would like to add. It's not currently in the PR, but the ability to load on a timer, there's got to be some more conversations around that. But I think that makes it even more powerful in that you can have a central repository of your configurations, you can update it, and you can know within, let's say, a few minutes that that configuration will have propagated to all your agents.
If you manually
So-
call the reload endpoint, does it reevaluate?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, thanks.
So that is the current way to do it. You can just call the reload, and it calls the loader func.
Yeah, so basically what I was aiming at. Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions? All right. So what I say is, feel free to give any feedback. PR is listed. I'm in the community Slack channel. If you would like to use it, I'm more than happy to hear from you. It's an experimental feature, so we're definitely something I feel is extremely powerful, but we also want to make sure we deploy it in a way that's usable and not just over complex. So if you're interested in using it, and I'm more than happy to chat with you and talk about your use cases.
Next release would probably be a good estimate
Yeah.
for when this is available.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, it's
In about
currently not
a
out.
month.
Yeah. But if you are interested in using it, I'm still more than happy to talk to you about your use cases. And then when it actually releases, more than happy to walk through you with a little bit to set it up and make sure it's meeting needs. All right. I will stop presenting then, and we'll go to regular business, which I don't have the agenda up. I don't know if anything's been added to the agenda.
No, I think it was just the demo.
Okay.
Does anyone have any questions in general about like the agent that while you have the team on the line?
No, I'm not sure if it's appropriate here because I'm like a real newbie using the Grafana agent, and I am basically looking for basic orientation into how to select the right metrics for shipping, because you need to restrict we have a Kubernetes cluster and we need to restrict the metrics because otherwise we would pay too much and ship too much.
Yeah, this is a common thing we run into a lot, I think.
Yeah.
So you have a Kubernetes cluster, you want to use Kubernetes SD configs.
Yes.
The rules, so we at Grafana Labs, we came up with a set of rules, which was every pod must have a label named name and a port on a pod which ends in like dash metrics. And that let us like have some basic control over what we scrape. That really only works if you're not using Helm, because Helm charts, who knows what you have control over. And like if you are using Helm, it just gets so much more complicated. And it seems like the direction we're moving in is towards the Grafana agent operator, only because it supports service monitors, pod monitors, and probes. And that gives you like the really fine-grained control of like, I only want to send this and nothing else. And I think that's the most helpful for cost. I think that tends to be the answer. Like you can emulate what the operator does with service monitors, but the answer is really just one job per thing that you want to scrape metrics from. So either have the operator generate that for you, or if you're just using the agent like directly, you can kind of follow that same pattern.
Yeah, I have a very simple use case at this point. Basically, I want to have just pod metrics like CPU and memory.
So if it's CPU and memory for pods, I think what all you need in that case would be like the C advisor metrics.
Yeah. And filter on the names, right?
Yeah, so you could ignore any we can help you out with that in the community channel.
Okay.
How to get those rules.
Yeah, thank you.
No problem.
Okay. Any other questions or comments, anybody? All right. If nothing else, we really appreciate everybody's time and coming here and chatting with us today. And we'll give everybody else the remainder of the time and see you all in about a month.
Thanks, Matt. Great job.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.
Thank you very
See
much.
you,
See
everybody.
you. Bye.
Bye.